Thank you very much, Brian. You must introduce me at more conferences. That's extremely flattering and kind. I'd just like to say thank you very much for inviting me here. It's an enormous pleasure to me to have any dealings with the Walton story, with the splitting of the atom story. As Brian said, it's a personal enthusiasm which I have trouble accounting for because, as some of you might know, I actually managed to get through my education without ever having a physics class of any kind. So it's a sort of perverse enthusiasm. It could, yes, I mean, it's akin with St. Vincent and the Grenadines publishing the stamp. It's a sort of curiosity of the business. But let me anyway inflict some of my scientific ignorance upon you and share some thoughts which run across my interests, which I have at least some legitimate claim to relating to news. And again, the inverted commas splitting the atom. I was in Manchester recently visiting what had been Rutherford's laboratory in 1911 when he, as it were, invented the nucleus. And there they have two plaques, not one but two plaques on the wall saying this is where Ernest Rutherford split the atom. Now, I will not. We could have an entire symposium on the question of whether this is splitting the atom or not splitting the atom. It's actually there in inverted commas because it's a media construct. It's a way in which newspapers were able to get a grip, journalists were able to get a grip on this story. So I'm not going to either defend it or decry it here. It's the shorthand we use. So let's start with the apparatus. I simply love this picture because it conveys so much about what the experiment was like and about the bits and pieces that were assembled, the sort of spare parts that had been run together. This is the fruit of more than 3 years of work. There had been a previous iteration of this apparatus which had been brought to the point of, actually, to the point of success, although they didn't know it. And then they'd abandoned it because it wasn't powerful enough and big enough and sort of shiny enough, except that's not very shiny. I don't know why the glass appears to be so filthy, and yet you were told that they spent ages polishing it. Anyway, that's the apparatus. So, in case anybody's in any doubt, what they're trying to do is accelerate using high voltages, 300,000 volts, down this tube here, a beam of protons, onto a target which will, the consequences of which will, they hope, tell them things. So on the, we mentioned the controversy, if it's a controversy about the date. I think it's the correspondence between Ernest Walton and Frida Wilson, his girlfriend, to become his fiancée, to become his wife, and indeed to become the mother of Philip, who is here, that actually nails this down. It gives us exactly which days things happened on. So I think it's on the Wednesday the 13th, as it were today, that Rutherford tells them, stop messing around with this, do some experiments. And he's actually, quite cross. And so the next day, it's a strangely leisurely world they lived in. The next day, not that day, they set up, or in fact, Ernest is on his own, because Cockcroft, as ever, is busy with something else. And so he sets up the experiment. And this involves an hour, perhaps an hour and a half, something like that, of getting things going, the various bits. You see there's a little motor there, there's another motor up there, transformers. Anyway, lots of bits to get working and to coordinate. And there is the highly sophisticated control desk. That's sort of around the corner from on your left where the camera was before. And that is John Cockcroft at it. These photographs were taken a few weeks later. That is Cockcroft at it. So you imagine that Walton is firing up this apparatus. He's at the desk turning things on. And then when everything is running and he's happy, he crawls across the floor on his hands and knees in order not to be electrocuted. and gets into this box, and this is him in the box. And at that stage, there was a black curtain. In fact, they've moved on. The experiment has slightly changed here. There was a black curtain, and there would have been a microscope in front of him. And so he's looking in at a zinc sulfide screen, looking into the microscope at a zinc sulfide screen, and looking for the fruits of this bombardment. It's hitting a target of lithium, and he's looking to see what happens. And he puts his eye to the microscope, and he instantly sees that there's an awful lot going on. An awful lot. I mean, it's pretty clear that they weren't generally expecting anything dramatic at all, anything in particular. Their previous expectation had been there might be gamma ray effects, but here they are. These are alpha particle effects. He must have known in the instant he looked at that screen that they had, as it were, split the atom. And so there's an enormous excitement. Everybody is called together, and Rutherford comes, and he is a bad knee at this stage, so they wedge him into this box, and he looks at this and he says, you know, those are definitely alpha particles. And there's a story that one version says that, and I should know because I named them, you know, he invented them, as it were. And so, you know, you get to this point where they're sitting around, Chadwick, Rutherford, Walton, and Cockcroft, and Rutherford makes a decision about news management. He says, we're going to keep this secret. We're going to have a news blackout. And this is what Walton wrote to Frida in Ireland about this, explaining it. The letter goes on to include a slighting reference, should we call it, to American scientists. He clearly had it in mind that he didn't want Americans jumping on this. But that was the sentiment. Now, this is a news blackout. This is a known media strategy. You keep control of your information. He wanted them to be absolutely certain of what they had to tell. A message that might have been learned in the recent CERN affair. Be absolutely certain of it, test their results. He wanted them to have their version of it in print, so that they would write a non-lurid account for Nature, and it would go in Nature, having a fairly quick turnaround. He expected it to be ready in a week or so. So they were going to keep it silent. They had another aspect to this media strategy, which is expressed here. This is John Cockcroft. Now, J.G. Crowther is a very, very interesting figure, but he's, in a sense, the first real science journalist in the British press. He persuades The Guardian to give him a brief to cover it. As a freelance, he's not on staff. And he has a background at the Cavendish. He'd been an undergraduate at the Cavendish. He was known to them. He worked for a scientific publisher after that, so they kept seeing him. Crowther was a known figure. And only a few weeks beforehand, the other enormous story of 1932 in science had happened in the same place, in the Cavendish. Chadwick had discovered the neutron, and Crowther had done this service for them. He had got it all straight in the press first. He'd been present at the first presentation by Chadwick of the neutron. He had written it up for the Manchester Guardian, and that had dictated the tone for the rest of the press. So, they clearly relied on him to get all this business straight. And interestingly, that actually they would simply just say, oh, go read Crowther, he's got it. That would be the end of it. And this way they would have control of it. Now, that, if you were one of those charming people, a PR consultant, you'd probably recommend this. This is what you do. You'd keep control of your information until you were completely happy about it, and you were ready to publish in your form. You would then brief a favoured reporter and get your story out. It's a good strategy. I'd recommend it. Alas, it didn't quite work out that way. I'm sorry for the grotty version of the print. I will have to go back and get another picture from the hard copy. But Reynolds Illustrated News, now completely forgotten, but it was owned by the Co-op. It was a Sunday paper, it was, you know, it wasn't a trash paper, but it was a popular paper, certainly. And it had, I think you can probably tell from that, it had no record whatsoever of covering science. Those are the headlines which give you a flavour. Here is the actual copy at the top of the story. It's a dream of silence that scientists have been. Split. Now, this, I mean, it's a sort of tribute to the press at the time. First of all, I explained that paragraph in the middle. The authority, lower down in the story, it's explained that Rutherford had been attending a dinner on the Saturday, and they had put, well, I say they put the story, I'm not sure that they say they put the story in front of him and said, is this right? And he signed it and said, this is more or less correct, or something like that. I just find that very hard to believe. But clearly they put something in front of him and he approved it. Now, this was a Sunday paper. Just in that night, the other papers chased this story up, so that most of the other Sunday papers had some sort of story. It wouldn't have been a front page story, but they had some sort of follow-up, some matcher, as we would call it in the newsrooms, in print. So it was the Sunday Express that Walton's landlady subscribed to, and she was able to find her tenants, her lodgers' name there in the Sunday Express, and presumably alert him to the drama. Sunday was therefore spent fielding phone calls and sort of trying to get things straight, I think, in a sort of desperate, slightly desperate way. I should say at this stage that where Reynolds has got this story from is not entirely clear, but there's a sort of reference, a passing remark in Cockcroft's correspondence, which suggests that he believes that it came from a Bristol University scientist who had attended, now there had been a Royal Society event during the week, and Rutherford had announced it there to scientists, and that this person on the Thursday night before the publication in Nature was due, and the Thursday night before this appeared on the Sunday, had then, as it were, leaked the story to Reynolds's, who had clearly got themselves very excited about it. Where Crowther lets them down, poor chap, because once this appears, Cockcroft is writing that letter, and it's a very angry letter. Says, you've let us down, we were relying on you. Poor Crowther was in Denmark at a symposium at the Bohr Institute in Copenhagen, following up the discovery of the neutron. And he was hearing the first theoretical conference to discuss that. Meeting Bohr and all the other eminent physicists of the theoreticians at the time, and he couldn't be in London, or it couldn't be in Cambridge to cover this, poor chap, but he did get it in the neck from Cockcroft. But he wasn't there, certainly, to sort of manage the story. This, then, is the picture you've seen. So that's Sunday. I believe this is the Monday, and as you've heard, it's a sort of rationed thing. Now, Rutherford is angry by now, it's pretty clear, and he's banned them from the lab. So sadly, there are no contemporaneous pictures of these chaps standing by the machine, which I would have preferred, and history would have preferred, I'm sure. Worse still, when Movie Tone News arrive a few days later with a crew from London ready to film the apparatus, Rutherford bans them from the lab, sends them packing, and they have no film. And as a result, we have no film of the apparatus, which I think is very sad. I would love to be able to, show film now of the apparatus. We would all know it very well. We'd know the whole story better. But it's only sort of. I do love this picture, particularly the exchange of looks. And as I always say when I show this picture, you just have to look at Ernest's pockets. The family tell me that's going to be pieces of string and screwdrivers and other bits of gubbins. It's not stylish, is it? So the story, you get, they try to manage the story. The management falls apart. Reynolds is running with this quite lively story about this huge breakthrough, energy being cheap and easy and all that sort of thing. Rutherford is very angry and they're all very uncomfortable. Cockcroft is writing angry letters to Crowther and so forth. And then Rutherford gets this. This is the 3rd of May, so it's the next day. And I don't know if you can read it, but American scientists inform us our story. This is from the Associated Press, a big American agency, 1,400 outlets in the United States at this time. Inform us our story on work doctors Walton and Cockcroft not sufficiently clear. This is because, can I remember what it was they said they were doing? It was some completely impossible transmutation they had suggested was taking place, having picked up some of these very garbled stories. So they got scientists got back and said, "You're talking nonsense." So they come back to Rutherford and say, "Please help." In fact, it's clear that they I was going to say emailed, they telegraphed all 3 of them to try and get some help. They were desperate. And in fact, Crowther gets back and does write a story which is sent to the US. I'm not sure it's the same one. I'm not sure it was that quick, but Crowther certainly steps in as soon as he can to help. And once that happens, things start to get back on the sort of keel that Rutherford had been hoping for. Gets back on the sort of sensible level, and people start to discuss things more. It starts to become more clear, more accurate. Here is a story from the New York Times, from I think it's the 3rd or 4th. 2 British. You can see the bits. Tests made for 3 years. There they are, Dr. J.D. Cockcroft. Poor Cockcroft suffered the fate of having his name misspelt all around the world. There's a missing C there, Cockcroft. And I've seen in the archives of both men, there are cuttings and there are references to cuttings. From Argentina to India, from the west coast of the United States to the east coast, there are these clippings, and almost all of them misspell poor Cockcroft's name. A couple of days later, so 3 days in 1 week, this story features in the New York Times, substantial pieces. And a couple of days later, on the Sunday edition, they have a big feature. As you see, it's quite the treatment. There's very little. Certainly, it's far quicker on the story than the British press in terms of developing it and providing a sort of really intelligent insight, I think. Just in case, this is for the scientists. This is much influenced by the work of Van der Graaf, as you can probably tell. This is a Van der Graaf belt, and is clearly based on interviews with, there is his name, Van der Graaf, and probably Tuba as well in Washington. That's a close-up of the marvellous apparatus that never happened. Now, I'll jump ahead of myself a little here. Poor Soddy described as soggy on the radio this morning. Okay, well, so what's gone on here and what's gone wrong here is that, and it's a tension that's still with this story, is that the potential of splitting the atom is it turns it into a story. So while Rutherford and Walton and Cockcroft, I swear in all my research, I never found any discussion between them or any correspondence by them at the time in any sort of serious scientific context in which they were talking about unlimited supplies of energy and or indeed blowing up the planet. This was never in their heads. They knew that what they were doing was a very, very, very long way short of that. And they were doing the fundamental science and knew they were. What, of course, crashes into that is the public understanding of the word atom that had developed by 1932. And I'm very struck, I was very struck, and I only sort of saw this very recently, by a comparison. So if you look, Frederick Soddy was a collaborator of, I mean, a very serious Nobel Prize-winning scientist, a collaborator of Rutherford's, who wrote a book in 1912 called The Interpretation of Radium. And it's mostly a fairly straightforward, sort of, not popular science book, but a sort of intelligent reader's science book. And it has a final chapter in which he speculates, he lets loose about what actually, you know, the energy in the atom might mean. And it's couched in quite dramatic terms. So you can see here, it carries with it the power to unlock the internal energy of matter. Scarcely be doubted that one day we'll come to break down and build up elements in the laboratory that we now break down and build up, and the pulses of the world will then throb with a new source of strength. A race which could transmute matter would have little need to earn its bread by the sweat of its brow. There's a fantastic phrase, actually, which I should have got in here, which is, he talks about a smiling Garden of Eden. And you imagine yourself sort of leaning back and just everything being done by energy. And then this line, a £1 bottle of uranium oxide. So Soddy writes that in 1912. It provides the foundation for an H.G. Wells novel, which is among his least famous, I think possibly because it was published virtually on the day that the First World War broke out, called The World Set Free, which, contrary to its name, actually links in a rather dark way, the theme of this potential in terms of energy and not needing to earn its bread by the sweat of its brow with the potential for destruction. So, in fact, the world set free, the world is cleansed by a nuclear war first, and then everything's much better. So that, I mean, that's Soddy's vision, and it feeds on then into this famous play, Wings Over Europe. And the Wings Over Europe is actually written in 1928, but it has a long success in the US. It opens in London in 1932, in this week in 1932, in the West End, and it's being reviewed in the same papers that are reporting the breakthrough. And it's one of those fantastic moments in which, you know, fiction seems to become fact. And I'm sure that it contributed to the excitement and the sort of the over-dramatization, the Reynolds' Illustrated News effect of the story. But compare these sentiments here with what you read in Reynolds' Illustrated News. And I think those, you know, I kind of feel that he got the book out of the library and opened it up and started, you know, cutting and pasting, as it were. I can't believe that the reporter hasn't been influenced pretty directly by this work, if indeed he didn't have it open beside him. And I think that's one of the things that's, you know, Rutherford is so furious because the fiction has overtaken his fact in a way and swallowed it up. He's thrown by it, and all his plans to do this carefully. Why was he doing this carefully? Why was he thinking that? I'm sure that this had some of it. He was hoping to avoid some of this, but he didn't. The consequences are manifold. There is a famous incident in Rutherford's life in which, not long after, I mean a couple of years later, in which he's said to have been asked about the prospects for nuclear energy and described it as moonshine. Now, my feeling is that reflex comes from these days. It comes from this idea, just stop talking about that. You know, I don't want to hear about that. That's got nothing to do with what my people are doing. it was a sort of irritated reflex more than anything, I'm guessing. But there are other incidents. Richie Calder, who goes on to become a very fine science writer, visits the laboratory on behalf of the Daily Herald a few weeks later, maybe a bit more, a month or so later, and is allowed to go in and look at the apparatus and is allowed to hear it hum. But he's only allowed after being sat down outside and given a very stern lecture. And Rutherford apparently fishes out of his pocket some of the cuttings from the papers about the drivel, is the word he uses, that gets published about that's been published about his scientists. He is very angry about it. He's not the only one. Well, angry may not be the right word, but disillusioned might be another. And this is a quote from Walton, from that correspondence with Frida Wilson, which I should say is extremely charming, extremely engaging. It's lovely. A lot of the letters early on begin, "Dear Miss Wilson," and it's only in this week. It's only in this week that he drops the W. He's been signing himself Ernest W. And he says, "I hope you don't mind, I'm just going to drop the W now." That's 2 years. But at the end of all this, back in Ireland, Frida has been collecting the cuttings and really enjoying it, although she hasn't shared the fact that she knows this young man, is in correspondence with this young man, with anybody around her. It's really interesting. It's very, very sweet. But at the end of the week, he voices a sentiment. There they are. Which is, I feel I ought to cut and paste this and send it to Lord Justice Leveson, investigating the British press. But that is the that's an experience that is not exclusive to them. I would defend, as a journalist, the press this far in this instance, which is that they did write about the story and they did get it known. Okay, they fumbled it, they made a mess of it, they got overexcited. They did get it known, and I would say that there are quite a lot of journalists who would say, well, maybe in a way they were right. If you take the long view, there was a lot of nuclear energy. It was never quite as cheap as we were promised, and never too cheap to meter. But maybe they had some sort of ultimate public interest justification, I suppose. As a case study in scientific news management, I'm afraid the disintegration of the atom in 1932 was a disaster. Thank you very much.